Profesor Grossberg es profesor distinguido Morris Davis en comunicación, y en estudios culturales en la Universidad de Carolina del Norte en Chapel Hill. Y es profesor adjunto distinguido de antropología, geografía y estudios americanos en la misma universidad. Estudió en la Universidad de Rochester, donde estudió filosofía e historia, y hizo estudios de posgrado en la Universidad de Birmingham con Richard Hogarth y Stuart Hall en el Centro de Estudios de la Cultura Contemporánea. Después viajó durante 2 años con una compañía teatral como actor por Europa y después regresó a Nueva York, donde trabajó como periodista y como taxista. Hizo su doctorado en la Universidad de Illinois, en donde empezó también a trabajar, donde inició su carrera académica y después pasó, como ya dije, a trabajar en la Universidad de North Carolina. Sus principales libros: New Keywords, a Revised Vocabulary of Culture and Society, We Gotta Get Out of This Place, Popular Conservatism and Postmodern Culture, Media Making, Mass Media in a Popular Culture, Caught in the Crossfire, Kids, Politics and America's Future. Y lo más reciente, Cultural Studies in the Future Tense. Este último libro está traducido al español, también recientemente. Entonces, dejo con ustedes al profesor Grossberg.
Hello, does this work? Can you hear me? Hello. I want to begin by thanking Renato and my good friend Eduardo for making it possible for me to be here. And I want to thank all of those people who have worked, largely in unpaid labor, I assume, to make this conference possible. I also want to apologize for my monolingualism. But as cultural studies suggests, there's a good and a bad to everything. And the good side to my monolingualism is that in a world in which everything is changing, the one thing we can continue to rely on is the parochialism of the Anglo-American population and their refusal to learn another language. I also bring you thanks from the Hall family. I spoke to Catherine Hall, Stewart's widow, and told her about this conference, and she asked me to communicate her gratitude at honoring Stewart at this conference. After this morning's lecture, I think we can all agree that the world is in trouble. Putting it more colloquially, the world sucks. The question is, what are we to do about it? Let me tell you in advance that I have no answers, but that it seems to me I want to try to suggest to you cultural studies is one of the ways of doing the work that might begin to provide the answers. I did not come here to tell you what cultural studies should look like in Latin America. I do not know what traditions of thinking there exist in the Spanish, Portuguese-speaking worlds that you can draw upon in order to create your own versions of cultural studies. I do not even claim to be able to recognize it without understanding more about the Latin American context than I do at the moment. I know that there are people in Latin America who are deeply suspicious of cultural studies as a project that emerged in post-World War II Britain and that has been taken up and to some extent globalized by the Anglo-speaking world. But as I hope you will see by the end of my comments, cultural studies does not believe that origins guarantee the course something must follow or the ways it can be taken up, used, and reformulated. Still, it is worthwhile saying a word about the origins. Cultural studies did emerge in one of its most visible forms, although I think there were other emergences, such as the work of Nestor Canclini and Martín Barbero in Latin America, the work of the Subaltern Group in India, and the work of a number of Chinese scholars in the 1960s. It did emerge out of, in all of those cases, and in response to, a moment of very rapid and profound social changes and profound social struggles. A moment marked structurally and experientially by a constant sense of disruption, crises, but also of possibilities. And just as importantly, a moment in which matters of what Marxists glibly called the superstructure, or what we today call culture, more specifically, were central to whatever was happening in the world and in the specific locations of the world. Cultural studies emerged as a response to that situation. It argued that the vital energy of social change that confronted those of us who wanted to direct the world into more humane possibilities required new forms of knowledge production, built on new forms of intellectual work and new forms of rigor. It was not defined by the assumptions of universality, for it precisely began with the assumption that it was the universality of Eurocentrism, of the European Enlightenment, that enabled Europe, in the name of what were apparently good values, to create regimes of domination, violence, and even, as Benjamin described it, barbarity. It sought, and I quote now from Richard Hoggart, it sought, quote, a rigor imposed by the absolute necessity to be right as one could be, as right as one could manage to be within the limits of our own respective positions. Because to be wrong in this situation was to be cast adrift on the tides of social change, to become objects rather than subjects and authors of history. Let me add that I think the greatest embarrassment of the intellectual left in most of the globe of the past 50 years is that despite all of our continued efforts, the world continues to manifest ever more profound forms of anti-humane social relations and existence. As you may know, Stuart Hall died earlier this year. He was not just the most influential and articulate practitioner of cultural studies in its English version, but as the response to his death made clear, he was something of a unique individual. He tried to articulate in his life and in his work a different way of being a political intellectual, a different position of political subjectivity, a different sort of embodied way of struggling to make the world better in his personal presence and his behavior, his interpersonal relations, his institutional labors, and his intellectual production. But I do not want to dwell here on my love for Stuart and my grief, which many people around the world have expressed even more profoundly than I can. Instead, I want to talk about what I learned from Stuart Hall, how I learned to embrace cultural studies as a political intellectual, how I learned to think of cultural studies in terms of a project a premise, and a practice. Let me warn you, some of the things I have learned from Stewart may not sound all that new or unique, and I would just ask you to withhold your all too quick judgment until all the pieces are on the table, as it were, for they work together to inflect and define one another. Nor do I think that Stewart or cultural studies was the only intellectual formation developed after the Second World War that attempted to embody some of the lessons that I'm going to try to impart to you. The first thing I learned from Stewart was to take seriously the need not only to find sources of optimism of the will, but also that optimism depends on offering a compelling vision of political possibilities, a new and expanded conception of what, for lack of a better word for the moment, we might call socialism. But such an expanded version of political possibilities has to be what Stewart and others have called a popular politics. It has to connect with people's lived realities. It has to address people where they live their lives, where they are, and it has to attempt to move them only as fast and as far as they are willing to go. It does not help to create a politics that tells people that they are fascists, conservative, idiots, dupes, etc. In this process, of course, of moving people, of engaging people in their lived realities, we put ourselves at risk. We change ourselves, and in the process, we may change our own political assumptions and our own political sense of possibilities. In this sense, the political optimism that Stewart Hall taught me was aimed against all forms of vanguardism and elitism in which one could tell people politically that we know what they should want, even if they don't know it yet. The second thing I learned from Stewart was that such optimism has to be built in conjunction with what Stewart, following Gramsci, called a pessimism of the intellect. That is, it has to be based on a new analysis of the political, economic, and social relations and dynamics of what we might call our times. We need to tell better stories. We need to tell the best stories we can. One might suggest that if we've been telling the same Marxist story about the evils of capitalism for 200 years, and this is where it's gotten us, maybe we ought to reconsider whether that's the best story we can tell. That isn't to suggest we suddenly embrace capitalism, but maybe the story is not sufficient and does not speak to people where they live. And such better stories have to be built on the most rigorous, analytic, intellectual, theoretical practices and resources that are available to us. Right? And that means, and I'll come back to that, that it has to not buy into, in the first instance, the values, logics, norms, and practices of the contemporary academy, which was designed both to answer needs of previous moments and now increasingly designed to reproduce the social relations of the existing systems of domination. So as I'll suggest later, we need to reinvent the university. Small tasks. Part of what that lesson of pessimism of the intellect entailed is perhaps the most radical thing to say to academics in the United States. I speak only from my experience in the United States, and that is that ideas actually matter. That the work we do actually does matter. Right? It is not simply the endless production of esoterica. It is the attempt to understand what's going on in the world in ways to make it, that might enable us to make it better. Stewart Hall was absolutely convinced, with all the passion of his political hopes, that knowledge mattered, and better knowledge mattered more. If you want to change the world, you need to understand it better than the other side. And my great fear, at least again in the United States, is the other side understands what's going on much better than we do. How and why? We have to understand how and why societies continue to produce all manner and forms of inhumanity and inhumaneness, of inequality, injustice, violence, enslavement, subordination, etc. All forms of social relationships that limit the possibilities of people's lives, all in the name of the virtues of freedom, individuality, and justice. That is, we have to accept the inseparability of political and intellectual struggle. Without the knowledge of specific realities of power and the specific hopes and aspirations, fears and angers of the people living in those relations, we will continue to tell bad stories and lose the struggle, if not immediately, certainly eventually. At best, ending up in what Nestor Canclini called the sham of democracy, or what De Sousa Santos describes as a sociology of emergences without a sociology of absences. These two lessons define for me, if you will, the project of cultural studies. It is a project which I hope many people share. Ah, thank you. Oh, look at that. Isn't that intelligent? Isn't that good? But I think cultural studies, Stuart Hall taught me two premises. One is, in this belonging together of intellectual and political work, culture matters. Culture in all of its manifestations is somehow at the heart of the inquiry into what's going on in the world today. Culture as a historically constituted domain or set of domains, often differentially valued, domains of forms of expression such as popular culture, high art, etc., etc. But also culture as discourse, as a constitutive dimension of all human life, what cultural studies might refer to as the medium of articulation or relationality itself. But also culture as the forms of life and the maps that organize them. That is to say, culture in relationship to common sense, culture in relation to what Raymond Williams calls the structures of feeling, and cultures in relation to what Stuart Hall referred to as the popular logics of calculation, the ways in which people calculate what decisions are to be made, whether it is reasonable to go out and protest and get arrested, given the costs of that. We must take into account what those logics are and not simply dismiss them. But in the end, cultural studies is not about culture. Right? It's not about becoming an interpreter of cultural texts or of some enclave of imaginative, communicative work. Rather, it's about the inextricable interconnections of culture with social structures, historical trends, economic organizations, social relations, and political institutions. Right? In that sense, Stuart Hall once said, if you want to understand culture, study everything but culture. Fourth lesson, the second premise, is perhaps more common, and that is that the fundamental unit of social analysis is, as it were, relations. The world is constructed through relations. Lived reality and social change and critical analysis all together must take account of the fact that the fundamental reality we live in is one of relations. It is this fact that cultural studies, in its British version, refers to the notion of articulation as the making, unmaking, and remaking of relations. Right? That is to say, Stuart Hall taught me that relations, structures, unities, identities are real. Unlike deconstruction, which would argue that they have no reality, cultural studies through Stuart Hall argues that such things are real. But they are never fixed, never stable, never permanent, never universal, and never natural. they are precisely what human history is about, the struggle to make relationships and to unmake those relationships. Therefore, relationships, although real, are always contingent. In Stuart Hall's famous phrase, there are no guarantees. The only guarantee is that there will always be relations. And if we think ourselves having finished our task by deconstructing whatever relation they may be, black versus white, male versus female, working class versus bourgeoisie, if that's the end of our task, then we will have abandoned the struggle because someone else will remake the relationships. Right? We will have rendered ourselves the objects rather than the subjects of history. Right? So the only guarantee is that there are relations, right? Not that there are no relations, but that there is always a struggle to remake relations. Deconstruction is always followed by reconstruction. In that sense, Stuart Hall suggested cultural studies is neither essentialist, believing in permanent identity, unity, structure, organization, nor is it anti-essentialist, believing that every unity can be deconstructed. It is, in Paul Gilroy's famous phrase, anti-essentialist. Right? It believes that there are relations, but they are contingent. Right? So those are the premises that Stuart taught me towards being a political intellectual. Finally, let me talk about what I would call the practice of cultural studies. And the first is the most difficult. And the speaker, the wonderful speaker this morning, ended by saying this, think contextually. Think contextually. Not, as we often are trained to do, to put context in the first or the last chapter, right, as a kind of background or framework. If you want to understand this, this is what you have to know, sort of a whole history, which you can't possibly know, right? But to see that context is both the object of analysis and the determining force of our analysis. Context understood as a multidimensional field of relations is what cultural studies is about. Right? It's not about culture, it's about understanding the context. Right? With culture as an absolutely vital element, and for many of us, our way into the context. There may be other ways. In this sense, one must think of context neither as fixed, stable, geographically and temporally predefined entities, nor as some kind of random, disorganized, fluid chaos, for example, in the way Latour ends up kind of assuming. Rather, context must be understood as changing and active, as organized and organizing. Now, in one sense, this is an entirely unoriginal idea. Right? It goes back to many thinkers. For Stuart, who once wrote, this is nothing but, he said, quote, a rigorous application of Marx's premise of historical specificity. It is Foucault in a certain way, right? Foucault as a radical contextualist. It is the pragmatists, those of you who are interested. It appears at certain moments in the Frankfurt School and their critique in the dialectic of enlightenment and negative dialectics of the traditions of Marxist thinking. Right? It is to say that all truth is contextual. That does not bring us into relativism. This is crucial. Cultural studies is not relativist. It believes there are truths, but the truths are contextual. Right? And there is no guarantee that what is true in this context will be true in another context, but that doesn't mean it isn't true in this context. Right? Truth is contextual. Moreover, and more radically, theory is contextual. Right? Theory is contextual. That is, theory is a strategic response to a context and to a set of political struggles and problems that a context poses to you. I once wrote about Stuart Hall after his death, which I guess wasn't so long ago. that he was, I thought, one of the great theorists of the 20th century, but he was unique because he was a theorist without a theory. Right? He never advocated a theory. He was against theory for its own sake. He was against using theory as if it provided you with the answers. You know? Oh, yes, I'm a Marxist. I already know the answers. I don't have to do any work. I know the answers. I know it's about the class struggle, or I know it's about capital accumulation, or whatever. Or yes, I'm a feminist and I know, what is going on. For Stewart, the question is always, what theories are most useful for freezing open the complexities of the context in order to open up the possibilities of political struggle? Right? He once said, theory too easily lets you off the hook. But it also means that thinking contextually, to contextualize politics. Right? You can't know ahead of time, as you enter into the attempt to analyze a context, what the political struggles and stakes of that context are. And you can't know what the solutions are, because politics, too, can let you off the hook. Right? Now, I want to say something about this contextualism, because I think it is part of the problem when people think about Stuart Hall and British cultural studies, and then imagine moving it, as it were, horrible image, into Latin America. And I want to say that Stuart Hall never thought that was what one was supposed to do. When he wrote about Gramsci, the Italian Marxist whose work was quite influential at certain moments in Stuart's career, he says that he opposes certain attempts, Althusser's was one of the most obvious, to make Gramsci into a generalizable universal theory, right? As if Gramsci were not theoretical enough. Instead, he writes, and I quote, "To make more general use of Gramsci's concepts, they have to be delicately disinterred from their concrete and specific historical embeddedness and transplanted carefully into the new soil with considerable care." Right? That doesn't mean you read subculture theory and suddenly apply it here, or you read encoding, decoding, and suddenly apply it here, or you read Hall's hegemony theory and suddenly apply it here. It means you take those concepts. Think about what someone like Stewart or Paul Gilroy or Dick Hebdige was doing with it. Gently lift them up, move them, begin to insert them into a context to see what possibilities they may enable you to open up, what they might enable you to see that you hadn't seen before. This radical contextuality is, I think, what is often missed in Stuart Hall's work. And he says at one point that he thinks certainly people in the United States often misunderstand him. That is, Stuart never offered a general theory of race. He was not interested in a general theory of race. He was interested, as he puts it, in how a particular society was being racialized at a particular moment, right? He's interested in the context of the society and how race was being constructed and deployed in ways that furthered certain political struggles and not others. And he says very explicitly, I'm not interested in offering a theory of identity and difference. In fact, he says, at a certain moment in the 1970s and 80s, he did think that understanding that race was constructed through relations of difference was an important political, opened up important political insights. And then in the 1990s, he writes, that era is over. Anyone who thinks that a theory of identity as difference is now a politically progressive possibility in the British context now has not done the work of understanding how the context has already been changed over the course of 2 decades, in part because capitalism and conservatism are smarter than we are. They actually read us. they took up the notion of difference. They realized that they could use difference precisely to further the forms of political power that they wanted to champion. Okay, that's 5. The 6th thing I learned from Stewart was to learn to live with complexity. Complexity both as multiplicity and as contradiction. Let me tell you a story once. I was on a stage debating the state of children in America with a psychologist. And it was arranged so we each gave papers, and then we each responded to each other's papers. So I gave a paper, he gave a paper, and then he responded to my paper. And what he said was, I don't understand what Professor Grossberg has done, because he took an already too complicated situation and he made it even more complicated. And I stood up and said, well, I don't understand what Professor, his name is not relevant here, has done, because he took a complicated situation and he oversimplified it. And how could you possibly formulate good responses to a situation if you begin by oversimplifying it and eliminating all the rich complexity that defines it precisely as a lived human set of relations of power, and not an abstract structure of generation or cognitive psychology or whatever you have. To put it simply, cultural studies for Stewart was opposed to any form of reduction or simplification. Nothing is ever all about any one thing. And in the end, there is no bottom line. We don't get to say, in the end, it's really about capitalism, or in the end, it's really about heteronormativity, or in the end, because the end is never there in a complex world. There is no final resolution to the analysis. Whether you understand it in Althusserian terms of overdetermination or in Deleuzian terms of connective logics and, it means that we are obliged to embody, embrace, and amplify, but through better stories, the complexity that faces us. Right? It also means that we cannot fall back onto the too easy binarisms that dominate much of our work, such as domination versus resistance, or in contemporary United States, I don't know if it's happening here, vertical versus horizontal politics, sometimes referred to as state versus autonomous politics, right? As if this were a binary choice that was available to us to organize the world. For Stewart, there are no vertical politics and there are no horizontal politics. There are only complex mixtures of both. It is always complexity and hybridity all the way down. Hybridity is not an answer to any political question. Hybridity is the assumption with which you start. Right. 7th lesson. You have to make a choice, a political choice, about what Stewart called the level of abstraction, at which you're going to work and at which you're going to organize politics. There are at least 3 different levels that one could identify, and there are probably more, right? But I'm going to oversimplify. Right? One can deal with the situation. Right? That is, in the United States, we can now struggle over the midterm elections that are coming up and whether the Democrats will lose control of the Senate. It is a local struggle. We can struggle over the immediacy of carbon trades as a possibility for ameliorating the global environmental crisis. Right? These are local situation struggles. And too often, people assume that being contextual means that you focus at the level of the situation. At the other extreme, there is a level of what you might call the epochal. Right? Now, different theorists have different notions of the epochal. Postmodernism was one really bad attempt to think epochally. Some might say that Foucault's notions, Foucault thinks in terms of epochs. So discipline, the epoch of discipline, the epoch of biopower, et cetera, et cetera. These are large-scale changes that take place over centuries, long-term, if you think of the Annales School's version of history, right? And they operate at a level of abstraction such that it is often very difficult to make analyses of more concrete situations, right? So if you're thinking about the transformation of capitalism into finance capital, right, it's not actually very helpful to understand what's going on, for example, in Argentina, right, or what's going on in the United States, because in fact, the transformation of capital into finance capital is a global phenomenon that's taken place since Richard Nixon abrogated Bretton Woods in the 1970s. So it's 50 years across the globe, right? Not very helpful to understand the particular, concrete, local. Cultural studies, Stuart Hall in particular, proposed a third level of abstraction between those, which he called the conjuncture, a term he took from Gramsci, but gave it a new meaning, right? To think conjuncturally is to understand a social formation, not necessarily in terms of a predefined spatial and temporal, it's the United States in the 1970s, but in terms of an accumulation, an articulation of multiple contradictions. A conjuncture comes into being when there are a whole variety of struggles and contradictions taking place, and at some point, they end up entering into relations with each other. So they redefine the context as a broader struggle. In which, for example, one might think of the United States since the 1970s on as a conjuncture in which certain key political problematics, the problematic of capitalist profit, but also the problematic of democracy, and the problematic of the proliferation of difference, and the problematic of immigration, and we could go on, all of these struggles and contradictions come together, right, to constitute a new kind of political space, what Gramsci called an organic crisis and what Stuart Hall called a conjuncture. A conjuncture is fractured and conflicted along multiple axes. It's a complex situation, multiple lines of force and determination. If you think about the financial crisis of 2007, in one sense, right, what was disappointing about it is that the conjuncture didn't quite come together. Many of us on the left thought this financial crisis would bring together, it would be the point of articulation of all these other struggles that were taking place, and we would make visible the political problematic of the contemporary conjuncture, again, in the United States, and it didn't happen, right? The conjuncture didn't articulate. It didn't come together, or maybe it's fairer to say the left didn't do the work of making those relationships explicit. The conjuncture, then, is an articulation of multiple overlapping, competing, reinforcing struggles and projects with different timelines and different temporalities, some going back centuries, some emerging only in the past decade. It creates multiple points of consent and compliance, of commitment and resistance, of crises and struggles. Right? So the first struggle is over how to constitute the conjuncture. Where does one see the multiplicities, the contradictions? Right? How does one construct a fragile and temporary unity that would enable us to see what Gramsci called the organic crisis? Right? Or enable us to see what the Jamaican anthropologist David Scott calls the problem space. Right? To let the conjuncture speak to us to describe the fundamental problematic. I don't know if you're familiar with David Scott's work. He has a wonderful book on C.L.R. James, on C.L.R. James's reading of the Haitian Revolution. Right? And he points out that C.L.R. James made a small change in the second edition which he says makes all the difference in the world. Because in the second edition, C.L.R. James, Scott argues, realized that the Haitian Revolution was doomed to failure. It was doomed to failure because it misunderstood the problem space. It misunderstood the conjuncture. It thought that the problem space was the problem space of political subjectivity. I want my freedom as a subject. But what C.L.R. James argues is, but no, that's a European problematic. That's not the problematic of the colonized peoples. The problematic of the colonized people in the Haitian Revolution should have been, I want another way of life. Not to predefine it as a question of freedom and subjectivity, but to define it as the contradictory necessity to create new systems of social relationships. Okay. To get the problem space wrong, Scott argues, following C.L.R. James, is to fight the wrong battle. I've been trying to argue this, as Stewart did in his readings of Thatcherism. If you're fighting the wrong problem space, you're playing the wrong game. You're going to the cricket field when the other team is playing basketball. I don't use sports metaphors. They never work for me, but you get the idea, right? You're fighting the wrong struggles if you get the problem space wrong. The second question the conjuncture raises is what is old and what is new, and how is each articulated in the conjuncture? Sometimes old forces like capitalism and religion continue to operate. But on the other hand, they don't operate the same way they did 50 years ago. They are re-articulated because they enter into new relations. Right? And new things that might emerge, like new media, they too are re-articulated by their relations to the continuing presence of the old. Right? The question is never what too many of us like to do because it's sexy. What's new? Right? Everything appears to be new in the end. Instead, Stuart Hall teaches us, or taught me to think, if the past was not so unified, then probably the present is not so fragmented. If the past was not so dominated by systems of coherent grand narratives, then probably the present is not so dominated by the complete absence of grand narratives. Right? Instead of setting up again an oversimplified binarism, we must see the complexity of the relations between the old and the new. We must then reject ruptural theories of history, and in that sense, epochal theories of history, in order to understand the complexities of the struggles we are facing. And finally, the question asked is, how does the conjuncture change? Because if the conjuncture isn't the specific situation, but endures across decades, not necessarily over centuries, how does the conjuncture change? And the answer is that, in a sense, for Stewart, different political forces are attempting to impose different strategies for solving the problems that the conjuncture poses. Those solutions, right, those what Gramsci called settlements, may work for a time, but they may also fall apart. So in fact, Reaganism in the United States was an attempt to answer the complex problems of the post-war conjuncture. It fell apart. Right? Clinton was another attempt at a settlement. God help us, Bush II was yet another settlement. Unfortunately, to our great disappointment, Obama has not yet even succeeded in posing a coherent settlement to the various crises that are on offer. But settlements keep appearing. Blair, Thatcher, the Conservative Alliance are all attempts to, in Gramsci's phrase, reconstitute the balance of forces, right? Not to destroy the enemy, not to dominate the enemy, but to reconstitute the balance of forces, to give the opposition a different space in which to operate, to allow them some limited freedom, to allow them even to enter into the settlement without thereby radically transforming the relations of power. Okay? If you're with me, we get there. The eighth lesson. If cultural studies is a different way to bring political struggle and intellectual research together without giving up the authority of knowledge or the passion of politics, one has to reimagine forms of authority. One has to think about how to speak authority with greater humility. And that means inventing new forms of conversation. Conversations which approach difference and disagreement with conviviality, in Paul Gilroy's phrase, but also with the necessary recognition of the inequalities of expertise and experience. Conversations in which we acknowledge that one cannot know in advance what the solution to the conjunctural struggles are, in which one cannot know in advance the ways different conjunctions are constituted in different geographies and temporalities, and that different conjunctures may not only answer questions differently, but pose them. One of the great problems with the model of research that I see in the U.S. Academy is our idea of globalizing the research is that we in the United States get to ask the questions, and then we find a research team in Venezuela to go and tell us what the answer to that question is, without ever bothering to ask whether that question is the question that needs to be asked in Venezuela or Argentina. How do you have a conversation in which one doesn't assume in advance that one knows what the questions are, but also understands in advance that the only way to find the answers is to have a conversation across those different conjunctures because of the interrelationships that involve in the world? That means changing the nature of the conversation of intellectuals in the world, opening it up across the boundaries of nationality, disciplines, and even the academy and the world outside the academy. Such a practice, and here's the 9th lesson, so we're getting there, okay, is that such work will require new forms of individual intellectual practice. It must be radically interdisciplinary. Now, interdisciplinarity is a buzzword in the U.S. Academy. Every university wants to claim it's interdisciplinary, and many of us think we're interdisciplinary. I have been struggling for 45 years to be interdisciplinary and not yet gotten there. Right? Because interdisciplinarity does not mean that you read theory from another discipline, right, and bring it into your work. And it does not mean that you read those texts from another discipline that you already know you agree with, right? So you want to understand the modern economic world, read David Harvey. Well, actually, I don't already agree with David Harvey. Read Doreen Massey, okay? But that's not what interdisciplinarity is. That would be the equivalent of someone coming up to a Shakespeare scholar and saying, I want to write a chapter in some book on Shakespeare, so just give me one book on Shakespeare that just explains the truth. You would say, well, this is a contested field. It's complicated. Different people know different things, have different ideas, have different understandings. How do you enter into the field of economics without understanding the domain of economic discourse in its complexity? I have a friend, David Ruccio, who was the founding editor of a very important journal called Rethinking Marxism. He did some research and found that in the past decade, there were more articles written in English about capitalism by people in the humanities than by people in economics. And he said, most of it is absolute shit, because they don't know anything about economics. You know, they think talking about commodification is understanding capital, or they think understanding capital accumulation is sufficient to understand the complexities of what's going on in the world. In fact, it's even worse, because Stuart Hall argued every discipline should be interdisciplinary, right? And cultural studies should be the interdisciplinary conversation amongst the interdisciplinary formations of the disciplines. Right? How could you study society without being interdisciplinary? How could you study literature without being interdisciplinary? Once those formations have become interdisciplinary, then we can have a conversation across those interdisciplinary disciplines, which would be cultural studies, the attempt to understand the complexity of a conjuncture. Moreover, such intellectual work would have to be collaborative, because in fact, none of us can actually do what I just described. Right? None of us could actually accomplish this. But this means giving up the very system of individuated values and rewards that the Western Academy is built on. Right? I don't know how you do that, but the irony of the center at Birmingham was that most of the people who are famous Birmingham graduates never got their PhDs because the books they wrote were collaborative. And no one thought that something like what may be one of the most important books of the 20th century, Policing the Crisis, was worth a PhD, despite the fact that 4 people wrote it, and only 4 people could have written it. Right? How do we reinvent these practices? Unless we are willing to struggle against the values of individualism and individual reward and our image of the lonely, isolated scholar writing his or her dissertation. Right. Okay. Finally, the 10th thing I learned from Stuart Hall, that the political intellectual remains above all else responsible to the world for the sake of our common humanity. Stuart described himself in this context by saying once, "I'm a theoretical anti-humanist and a political humanist." How can one struggle to change the world without being a political humanist? One must learn to live with the complexity, to commit to the very difficult and demanding work of offering better stories about what's going on in order to enable people to struggle more imaginatively and more effectively to remake the present and reinvent another future. Another more humane world is possible for cultural studies. Cultural studies may not be the only formation committed to this practice. I want to reaffirm that British cultural studies, in the form of the ideas, vocabulary, discourses of Stuart Hall, is not the only version of cultural studies that is in existence or should be in existence. But I think it is a project and a practice that is a valuable addition to the intellectual arsenal of those of us struggling to make the world a more progressive place. Thank you.
¿Tienen alguna pregunta en inglés o en español? Yo les haré la traducción. ¿En inglés, Pablo?
Yes, Dr. Grossberg. What is, in your opinion, the heritage that Stuart Hall keeps from the Birmingham project, and what is his most valuable own contribution of Stuart Hall in cultural studies? ¿Sí? ¿Cuál es lo que Stuart Hall toma de la herencia de la escuela de Birmingham y cuál es su contribución del propio Stuart Hall más valiosa a los estudios culturales?
I think I have come to reevaluate. I think I would have answered your question differently before Stuart died, in both halves, right? Because I think the Birmingham project is better understood as an attempt to institutionalize the project of cultural studies than as the project of cultural studies itself. Right? that is to say, and I'll come back, in a sense, my answer to the second question, and I think this is visible if you look at the extraordinary response to Stuart's death. You know, many great intellectuals have died in the past decades, Foucault, Derrida, but the response to Stuart's death is unique and extraordinary. And I think it's because Stuart embodied in his intellectual work, but in his work with the arts, in his involvement in political struggles, in his personal relationships, I think Stuart embodied for many people this project. I think Stuart embodied this notion. That's why I called it a political subjectivity. I think Stuart lived the belief of these 10 things, you know, that pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, not rigorous knowledge, all the things I described. I think he enacted that. I think he enacted it in his approach when he was called upon to lead the commission on the brutal attack on a young black male in England, the Stephen Lawrence Commission. I think he embodied, against the pressures of the various communities, he embodied these commitments, right? That it doesn't help us to just simplify this into white versus black. It's more complicated. We have to understand it. We have to look for the possibilities. He embodied it in his relationship to the Black Audio Collective and film, some of the filmmakers, in his relationship to Autograph, the black photographers, in his building of an art gallery for peoples of difference from around the world, Rivington Place in London. I think people talked in their responses to his death about how having met Stuart changed their lives because they suddenly realized there was a different way to be a political intellectual. Right? There was a different way. And when Stuart first came to the United States to a conference that I organized, a very large conference, it was very interesting because in the first, we had people teaching classes, eminent people, Gayatri Spivak, Fred Jameson, and no one had ever heard of Stuart Hall. And in the first of the meetings, these people taught like 8 lectures. In the first lecture, Gayatri, Jameson, all these big name peoples, they had like 800 people, and Stuart had 50. In the second lecture, Stuart had 1,200. Right? People were driving in from hundreds of miles away because word had spread that no one had ever seen a U.S. intellectual act like that. You know? He actually thought people were interesting. He actually treated people, students, with respect. He actually cared. You know, he walked up to people and, what are you working on? That's interesting. Tell me, because maybe it will help me think about that. I think he was, I mean, what his most important contribution was in a way, he served as a model. He served as a role model that we will all fail to live up to. I will. Maybe some of you won't. So I think, and I wrote this in one of the, in my obituary for Stuart. This project, he articulated this project in the 1950s when he helped form the New Left in England. Right? It was the same project. All of the elements here were there. What Birmingham was an attempt to say, my God, how does one do this work? Right? How does one actually, I mean, how many of you have jobs? If you have a 9-to-5 job, or as in the case of many political activists, and you have a 9-to-5 job, and then you go to a political meeting from 6 to 9, right, to plan your next protest, and you get home at 9 o'clock, do you really think you want to sit down and read Althusser? Right? No. You have to find, he thought, I think, an institutional context in which one could experiment with a new kind of practice of knowledge production. And Birmingham, the center, was much more radical than people realized. Do you realize admissions, for example, admissions to the graduate program was decided by the graduate students? Right? The faculty was simply there to take notes. I know of no other program in the world in which the graduate, because they said, well, it's a collaborative effort. you're going to have to work with these other people. Who do you want to work with? Right? They radicalized decision-making. I think it was an attempt to try to think about how one might institutionalize this. And the success is measured by the value of what they produced, which in many cases was quite good. Like many experiments, it could not be sustained for a variety of reasons, but that doesn't mean the experiment wasn't important, useful, something we can learn from, even in small ways. I mean, wouldn't it be nice? I was in Colombia and I was, saying to the graduate students, you need to take power. I'm an old man. I don't understand popular culture. I don't understand anyone under 30, right? Not because I don't talk to you or, sympathetic, because the world has changed so much since when I was a young person that I can't understand what it must be like to grow up in this world today. So why should I dictate to you what the questions are, right? I can help you. I can guide you to resources, but why should I tell you that you need to read Althusser? You should think about it. Personally, I hope you won't. No. But, we need to rethink the social relations of the production of knowledge. I think that's what Birmingham was about. And in that sense, I think it was quite crucial. And when Stewart leaves Birmingham, where does he go? He goes to the Open University, another place which is an experiment in knowledge production, because all of their knowledge production is in the context of writing textbooks for students. Some of Stewart's and other people's most brilliant research was undertaken in the attempt to write textbooks for undergraduates. I mean, could you imagine? I mean, in the United States Academy, you would just get laughed at if you said, oh, I want a research leave to write a textbook for undergraduates. Right? That was a new experiment. It was a different way. How do you do research in a context in which you are consciously thinking about how to communicate with people outside the academy and not just people in the academy? Right? It was a brilliant experiment, which also has been closed down to a large extent, but it can, these experiments continue.
Hubo hace unas semanas atrás, en Río de Janeiro, en Brasil, un congreso internacional llamado 1000 Nombres de Gaia, donde 1000 nombres de Gaia, Gaia como la diosa del planeta, donde sociólogos, filósofos, antropólogos, ambientalistas se propusieron a pensar el futuro del planeta delante del calentamiento global.
Okay. There was a meeting in Brazil where a lot of philosophers, anthropologists, sociologists were thinking about the world, the ecological problems of the world, the global climate world. Okay.
Y además, como problematizando las zonas de contacto entre el hombre y la naturaleza.
Problematizing the relation between man and nature.
Y como que eso hace para pensar el futuro del planeta y de la reconfiguración de las relaciones internacionales y del papel del hombre y de todas las cuestiones que de cierto modo atravesan esas cuestiones. Entonces, la pregunta es, porque eso no apareció por la mañana, por ejemplo, en la conferencia inicial, desde esta frontera del humano y de la naturaleza y de este problema que se parece desde el punto de vista de algunos.
He is saying that it's related to the conference, of the morning conference of Dr. Valenzuela, of the limits between nature and man.
Así como, por fin, ¿cómo pensar eso desde el punto de vista de la teoría de los estudios culturales? Si es posible pensar desde América Latina. Hay intelectuales como Isabel Stangers, como Bruno Latour, como Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, que piensan que la América Latina tiene un papel importante en este sentido para el futuro de esas cuestiones. ¿Cómo sería eso?
He wants to ask if Latin American thought, Latin American cultural studies have a possibility to think these problems from Latin America.
Yes.
Muchas gracias.
My knowledge of Latin American cultural studies is too limited. A number of us were talking about And I'm going to try actually to do more work to try to figure out how to change the lines of translation, right? So that more work, I mean, lots of English work gets translated into Spanish. Not so much Spanish work gets translated into English. And I don't seem to have any power in deciding which gets translated, right? So, I mean, part of it is I don't know the answer to the question, but I assume that every conversation taking place everywhere by intellectuals willing to accept and think through the complexities of the dilemma is a vital part of the conversation. So let me say one thing. These are complexities, right? There is no global environmental crisis. There are lots of global environmental crises. There's a crisis of species extinction. There's a crisis of global warming. There's a crisis of water. There are lots of different crises which may have interconnections, but they're not the same, and the solutions of one could exacerbate the other. For example, some research has just come out which suggests that the use of wind power in these gigantic offshore windmill things is actually destroying some species of fish and birds, right? So it's worsening the problem of extinction. Right? Moreover, I think, I have a friend, a scientist. I do have scientist friends. And one of them, he says, for example, we could solve the energy crisis today. That's not a problem. We know the technology to solve the energy crisis, right? We could stop carbon using carbon. There are two problems with it. One is there are economic forces at work that don't want those solutions, and part of that problem is, of course, it would devastate parts of the world, right? Parts of the world would be driven into abject poverty. Right? And the other is people, I mean, think about this in the United States. Half the United States doesn't believe in global warming. Half of the United States doesn't believe in global warming. There's a cultural dilemma here, right? There's a dilemma of knowledge and a dilemma of lifestyle. It's clear we would have to change our lifestyle. But it's hard to go to Africa and tell people who have dreams of living the capitalist lifestyle that they're not going to get to do it, right? Because we fucked up the world so much that, oh yeah, we'll pay our share, we'll downsize, but they're going to have to downsize before they ever got to upsize, right? These are cultural dilemmas that have to be analyzed, understood. Why do people, why do people make the choices they do? Why do they believe what they believe? So it's a very complex set of issues in which I think there has to be extraordinarily new kinds of conversations across geographical, institutional, artists, scientists, scholars in the humanities, or union members, indigenous peoples. It's easy for us to say, oh yes, let's downsize, and not, or let's stop using carbon, burning carbon fuels, and not think about the consequences of those parts of the world whose economy depends entirely on extraction. Now, extraction economies, shit, I mean, they're terrible, but to abandon them like that is devastating. I don't know how to think those complexities, but I would love to hear what Latin American thinkers are thinking about.
Yes, 25 years after Policing the Crisis and The Toad in the Garden, and after you diagnosed in the United States the popular conservatism in that postmodern condition as the dislocation between the affective and the political, what's the status 25 years after that? Has the dislocation, has that become just normalized, or how do you see that dislocation that you talked about and that Hall discussed in Toad in the Garden and as a conservative populism of 25 years ago? Después de 25 años de los escritos pioneros de Stuart Hall acerca del thatcherismo y lo que Grossberg diagnosticó en un momento como conservadurismo populista en Estados Unidos y como la dislocación de lo afectivo con lo político, ¿cómo ve esa dislocación 25 años después de esto?
One of my favorite philosophers of the 19th century was Mark Twain. And Mark Twain once said, when asked a difficult question, I am happy to be able to answer your question immediately and with absolute certainty. I don't know. I mean that seriously. I'm working on a paper in which I say, you know, look, I was too lazy. The world of affect, the world of people's structures of feeling is much more complicated than I gave it credit, you know. So if you think, just take one question, like the question of consent. And we tend to think, in the United States, I, again, don't want to speak anywhere else, you know, the left tends to argue as if everyone who isn't out on the picket lines has consented to the existing structure of power. And I think consent is a much more complicated, emotional, affective thing. And there are lots of different ways of consenting. You can consent wholeheartedly. You can consent grudgingly. You can consent fearfully. You can consent hoping that tomorrow you won't have to consent. These are empirical questions for me. And I think we don't understand any longer because we haven't taken up the question of doing the kind of empirical, theoretically defined but empirically driven research to understand where people are. What is going on in the world? We assume we know. We assume we understand that all these people who don't believe in global warming are idiots. They're not idiots. You know, some of my best friends, well, let's not go that far. Some of my neighbors don't believe in global warming. I don't understand them. I mean, they're intelligent people. In fact, a big research study just found that the majority of people who don't believe in global warming in the United States are college educated. You figure that one out. Would you not think? We don't understand what's going on. We don't understand how people are making these calculations, what they think that choice makes. We don't understand why they don't trust us. They would be crazy to trust us. Intellectuals lie, right? There's scandals everywhere in the United States around science. You know, data forged, scientists who got paid by pharmaceutical companies. You know, we're all cynical. They're cynical about science. You know, so why should they believe us when we say, look, we lied about all those drugs over there, and actually, when we told you shouldn't eat fat, we were wrong, because now they tell us you should eat fat, but you shouldn't eat carbohydrates, and you should drink coffee and wine, right? So we were wrong all those times, but now we're right. You know, why should they believe us? Right? I mean, we don't understand the complexities of people's relationships to these issues. So I really, literally mean, I don't know. Right? This is a complex empirical question, and any of you who'd like to join the research team to figure these out, you know, let me know, because I can't do it by myself.
In your presentation, you said at some point in a very clear-cut way that for the last 30 years, the left has been unable to analyze properly, to intervene in, and to stop the social injustice put forward by the development of capitalism. My question is, what do you think the role of cultural studies has been in this failure? En su presentación dijo que la izquierda en los últimos 30 años ha sido incapaz de analizar, de intervenir y de frenar el proceso de de injusticia social, digamos, vinculada con el desarrollo del capitalismo. Mi pregunta es, ¿cuál ha sido el papel de los estudios culturales en ese fracaso? Es decir, ¿cuál es la responsabilidad de los estudios culturales en ese fracaso de la izquierda para analizar e intervenir políticamente en ese proceso? Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Yes, I've got that. Mea culpa. Good question. One small point, and then I'll answer your question. It's not just capitalism that's the problem, right? I mean, it's not just that we failed to stop the movement of capitalism. We failed to stop a complex set of forces that are anti-democratic. You know, capitalism is not inherently anti-democratic, so it's a complex set of forces that we keep sort of missing, and they keep recombining in different ways and going around us. The role of cultural studies is good. I mean, cultural studies has failed. It's part of the problem. I would like to think it's part of the problem because of two reasons, two failures. One is because we have not made, I don't know quite how to say this without sounding like a vanguardist dictator, but I will. 90% of what goes on under the name of cultural studies in the United States has nothing to do with cultural studies, right? And we have been too cowardly to stand up to big names like, you know, Donna Haraway or Michael Hart, both of whom are friends of mine, and say, that's not the same project, right? And we have been unwilling to challenge the institutional structures of the academy that prevent us from instituting practices that would enable this project to flourish in the academy, right? That's the first thing. The second thing we have failed to do, and you know, it's partly why I'm here, is we have failed to establish the possibility of new conversations that take place across national formations and different conjunctures. Right? So we have remained. I want to say, in the end, there should be no such thing as Latin American cultural studies or Anglophone cultural studies. There should be a whole variety. You know, I was strongly influenced in my early career by Martín Barbero. I mean, his book on hegemony just sort of made everything clear for me. I understood Stewart through Martín Barbero. Right? Was I participating in Latin American cultural studies? Well, no, I was participating in a conversation which we need to expand. You know, the interesting both political struggles, I think, and challenges, and the interesting work in cultural studies, for me, is taking place in Latin America and Asia, much more so than in the English-speaking world. But the English-speaking world is the conduit through which conversations take place, fortunately or unfortunately, and we haven't done enough to find ways to augment that conversation, to make it real, right? And I'll stop with this. There was a famous interview with a right-wing guru in the United States in which he said, you know, our greatest fear, meaning the conservative forces in the United States, our greatest fear is that the left will actually realize that it has the most extraordinary think tank, global think tank, ever seen in the history of humanity, and it will actually use it to defeat us. And what is that global think tank? The university system, right? And, you know, we haven't done anything to sort of really ameliorate it outside the tradition. You know, you can go to the Latin American Studies, what is it called, LASA, yes, Association, and, you know, that's boring. Don't go to that, you know, we have to find new forms of conversation that enable us to, you know, say, I have resources you're not aware of, you know, and we have resources you're not aware of. And we have a view of the problem that you're talking about that you don't see because you're standing there and we're standing, right? These are conversations. I don't know how we do it, but we need to be willing to take risks and invent new ways of having a conversation.
Bueno, yo creo que ya paramos aquí por la hora y nada más le agradecemos al doctor.